Hi everyone, welcome to our Facebook Live Q&A event for this evening. It's my pleasure in a few minutes to be joined by Emily O'Kearney, who's a research assistant in the Neuroepidemiology Unit at the University of Melbourne. Tonight we're going to be talking about her research, which we've titled Diet Outcomes in Multiple Sclerosis. So, as with all of our Facebook events, this is going to give you an opportunity to ask questions directly to the researchers involved, which we find a really exciting part of these Facebook Live events that we do. Emily and I have some questions that we're going to be talking about to start with, but at any point if you have questions that you want to ask, all you have to do is submit them into the comment section below, and we'll make sure that we ask them on your behalf, and we will be getting through as many questions as we can tonight. So if you ask a question and we don't answer it immediately, don't worry, we will be answering it as we go through. Now, with all of these events, obviously it goes without saying that we're extremely grateful to the researchers for giving up their time to be involved tonight. Obviously Emily's already had a long day of work, so to come in and do one of these at 7:30 p.m. at night, we really appreciate it, and we are sure that you guys do as well. So make sure that you show her how much you appreciate her participating in one of these by having a really strong participation as well. So make sure that you like the video, that you do ask comments. That's the main reason why we're here tonight, is to get your comments and your thoughts. So not only questions about the research that she's doing, but if you have your own personal experiences in terms of diets that you might have used that you want to share, also put those in the comment section below. If you have other stories that you want to talk about, again, put those. We're just happy to engage in any discussion around these topics. So as we start to build the numbers of people that are watching, without further ado, I'm going to ask Emily to come in here. She's sitting patiently waiting for me to finish my opening spiel. So I'll get her to come in and join me.
Hi everyone.
Welcome, Emily. As you heard me saying, sitting off to the side, thank you for giving up your evening to come and participate in this event. We know from the response that we already saw to our post yesterday that people are really excited about hearing from you. Thank you in advance. So I might just start maybe by getting you to, I've done that a little bit, but maybe I'll get you to introduce yourself and tell people more about who you are and what you're doing.
Sure. So my background's actually in physiotherapy, and I completed a Master of Public Health in 2012. And since then I've been working on various disability projects. I've worked in Darwin and Cambodia, and I've worked at the Neuroepidemiology Unit for about a year now with Professor George Jelinek and the team. And I'm part-time here, and I'm still part-time as a physio actually. So I'm really excited to be joining everyone tonight talking about diet, and very keen to hear your stories and any interesting research that you've read as well.
Okay, fantastic. So our community has heard a little bit before from the Neuroepidemiology Unit. We did something in 2016, but maybe as a first point, you can tell us a little bit about the project that you've been working on in your time here.
Yeah, sure. So I focus mainly on one of the studies that the NEU is looking at, which is the Holism study. People might have heard of this. Holism stands for Health Outcomes and Lifestyle Interventions in a sample of people with MS. And that started in 2011. It's a longitudinal cohort study. So in 2011, the baseline data was collected from around 2,500 people. And then we did a follow-up survey in 2.5 years later. And we had about 1,400 people complete the survey again. So really that is looking at lifestyle modifications and whether they can slow or stop the progression of MS and improve outcomes. So some of the lifestyle interventions that we were studying included diet, obviously, exercise, stress reduction, vitamin D, sun exposure, omega-3 fatty acid, supplementation, smoking cessation and alcohol consumption. And some of the outcomes that we looked at were disability, relapse rate, depression, anxiety, quality of life, cognitive function, sexual function, and vision.
Okay, and so and the focus of what we're going to talk about tonight is mostly the diet aspect of that.
Yeah.
So how do you go about actually measuring what someone's diet is like?
Yeah, sure. So it's really tricky to measure someone's diet. There's quite a few tools out there, but really without sitting down and quantifying everything that you're eating, it is quite a tricky thing to measure. So our survey, the Holism survey, it's quite long because we're looking at all the things that I just stated. It's about 120 questions. So the diet tool that we used is called the Diet Habits Questionnaire, which is for people in cardiac rehab, and it was developed by HeartWise at Wesley Hospital in Brisbane. So it's looking at diet habits. So it's comprised of about 24 questions, looking at different food groups and food preparation. And we slightly modified that tool to fit with our survey so that there were 20 questions and a sum total of about 100. And it was interesting, at follow-up, so at the 2.5-year time point, our average diet score was 80. So it's quite a high diet score.
So can you explain what the diet score is for people watching? How do you determine what a diet score is? What's it out of?
Yeah. So like I was saying, the tool that we used, it's out of 100. And each question has a scoring of 1 to 5. So 1 indicates poor diet and a 5 indicates healthy diet. For example, the question around serves of vegetables eaten per day, a 1 indicates no serves of vegetables eaten, and a 5 indicates 5 or more serves of vegetables a day. And so then there's a total of 100.
Okay. And so as a sort of guide to, if I did what I wanted to and ate pizza every night, I don't do that. For anyone worried, I don't do that. But if I did that, what sort of score what that sort of really poor diet, what sort of score would you be getting for that?
Yeah, so I mean the lowest score is 20 that you can achieve.
Okay.
Yeah, so a score of 80 is quite high.
Yeah.
And that's probably telling of the participants in our sample. You know, it's a voluntary survey, so people that are interested in completing a health survey might be more health conscious.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And so looking at that sort of information that you've gathered from that, and obviously now being out at a 5-year time point, I guess is the latest that you've looked at. What are some of the outcomes that you've seen from that work? Yeah,
so just some brief figures. So the study that I've been working on this year, it's really looking at the baseline data and the 2.5-year data. We're still collecting the 5-year data at the moment. So we have 2 time points, and I was looking at diet at baseline and its relationship with outcomes at follow-up, so 2.5 years later. And we found that there's a significant relationship with diet and mental quality of life and depression. Also, just out of interest's sake, in the follow-up sample, 34% of people didn't eat meat and 42% didn't eat dairy.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so was there, in those groups, did you see anything different in the ones that didn't eat meat or didn't eat dairy, even if it's not necessarily significant at this point?
Yeah, so it is interesting. It looks like, especially people that didn't eat dairy, there's a trend towards a relationship with having decreased disability.
Okay.
So it'll be really interesting to see when we have the 5-year data, what happens there. I think that's the importance of the longitudinal sample. Really, disability takes a long time to progress, and if we really want to look at change in diet over time, we really need that follow-up period. I think 2.5 years, it's still a little bit early to be telling of what happens.
Yeah.
And there wasn't much change between baseline and 2.5-year follow-up in diet scores. So the average was about the same. The maximum change was only 4 points on the diet score. Yeah.
Okay, and I mean that data is going to be really interesting to people in terms of we know that from our community, lots of people do try and use diet as a way of helping manage their MS, but there's often lots of questions about what exactly should I be doing with my diet to maximise the benefits. So I guess that's something that this might help with.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that kind of correlates with some of the other studies that have been done around saturated fats as well.
So I guess you talked about the 5-year data, and I incorrectly before said we were talking about 5-year data.
Yeah, that's
the 5-year data, when are we expecting the outcomes of that to be?
Yeah, so hopefully we'll finish collecting that data very soon, within the next month, really. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
So yeah, that will be great to have 3 time points of data and to look at it over a 5-year period. We can really start looking at the changes in diet and how that affects health outcomes. Yeah, the other sort of study in the pipeline for the NEU is a randomized control trial, which will be called Stop MS. We're planning to start that in 2019. And so, randomized control trial, the experimental group will receive education sessions on a healthy lifestyle modification. And the study period will be about 5 years, looking to recruit around 750 people in New South Wales and Victoria. And we're partnering with the MS Society to raise funds and to implement this project. It's still in the planning stages because we're still seeking funding for this. And just in terms of the outcomes, annually there'll be a GP assessment, and the experimental group will also receive some coaching at that annual assessment, and also an allied health assessment. And then after the 5 years, those people will then go into a longitudinal cohort study for 10 more years to then keep monitoring what's happening there.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that sounds fantastic. So there's lots of exciting things happening at this stage in terms of the research that's being done here.
Yeah.
Okay. So for people, I can see that there's a bunch of new people who have just started watching. If you have just started watching, I'm here with Emily O'Kearney, who's a research assistant at the University of Melbourne, working in the neuroepidemiology unit. And we're talking about lifestyle modifications as a way of managing multiple sclerosis, and in particular, diet. So if you do have any questions that you want to ask Emily about her research, about diet and MS in general, or if you just want to share your experiences, all you have to do is just write a comment in the box below the video, and we'll ask that question. So we've just been talking about things like, one of the things Emily just mentioned was the fact that there seems to be a trend in the data at the moment for people who don't have dairy as part of their diet to maybe have better outcomes. So if you are someone who is using diet as a way of managing MS, have you cut out all dairy? And if so, have you found that that's been beneficial to you? That's something that we'd be really interested in hearing about. So please share your questions and your comments below. We want to interact with you guys as much as possible, so that you don't have to listen to me talk as much.
Sorry, I'll just add to that as well. We did see a trend with not eating meat, and decreased disability as well.
Okay.
Again, not significant, but it'll be interesting to see what happens with more time.
So again, if you're someone who's watching who has cut meat out of their diet, again, have you seen a benefit in terms of that? So one of the things that you talked about was that there seemed to be a decreased levels of depression in the cohort. Do you want to talk a little bit about that at all?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit. I think in the general population, there's starting to be emerging evidence for healthier diets and affecting depression. So that's really interesting. I know there's some research now with gut health, especially looking at depression. So that's a really interesting space to watch.
And we know that's really important for people living with MS who have much higher rates of depression than the general population. And we'll be putting a post up tomorrow on MS Translate related to that. But so again, that's obviously a really important space. Yeah,
and maybe I'll just sort of quantify the depression results that we found. It looks like with a 10-point increase on the diet score, there's a 20% reduction of depression risk.
Okay.
So, and that's adjusting for depression at baseline. So basically that means it doesn't matter what level of depression you started at, if you increase your diet to a healthier diet, you can decrease your depression risk.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so we kind of already have covered this, but for people who may have just started watching, a 10-point increase in score, like what sort of changes would you have to make to get a 10-point increase in score? It's probably nothing huge, right?
Yeah, I mean, the whole score is out of 100,
Mm-hmm.
so changing your score to be increased by 10 points is not that difficult.
Mm-hmm.
It might be things like, if you are eating dairy, cutting down to skim milk, or increasing your vegetable intake,
Mm-hmm.
choosing whole grains instead of white, eating more fish regularly instead of meat.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I guess that's one of the things that we hear from people a little bit in this space, is that they understand that there might be benefits from it, but that they think they will have to make radical changes to their diet and have to cut out everything that they enjoy. And it sounds like that's probably not completely true.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to say, because I think if you look at some of the previous evidence, especially this Swank study, which a lot of people may have heard about, that was a really long study, 34 years, where people were randomized to a very low saturated fat diet. And there were some people that couldn't stick to this diet over time. So basically the people that stuck to the low saturated fat diet achieved much better outcomes and saw a slowing in the progression to disability than people who didn't and had a higher saturated fat diet. So I think when you're looking at a study of that extent over 34 years, it is really telling that it's not just a diet, it's actually a lifestyle modification that does need to be stuck to over time, and quite a significant decrease, especially with the saturated fats.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but noting that there's lots of alternatives out there. Yeah.
Okay. I noticed Emily was looking at me there because she wants me to cut down on my pizza intake, apparently. So I've taken that on board. I'll be trying to improve my diet score over the next few months. So we've had a question come in. Thank you, Tony, for submitting your question. Make sure everyone who's watching, the ice is broken now. The first question's been asked, so try and submit your questions. We want to answer as many as we can. I'm not sure how easy this will be for you to answer, but we'll see what we can do. Tony's asked how you're measuring depression in this study.
Sure. So at baseline, we use the Patient Health Questionnaire 2, which is 2 questions. And then in 2.5, we decided to extend that to the same questionnaire, but it's more extensive. It uses 9 questions. So it's again, in a long survey, we're using quite a shorter tool to measure. It's a depression risk that we're measuring.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not a clinical depression tool.
Okay.
Obviously, when it's a self-reported online survey, yeah.
Is there a way for people to be able to say whether or not they have been diagnosed as part of that with clinical depression, or?
Gosh, that's a good question. I can't remember.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you have any idea what sort of questions are in? Again, I know with diet was the main thing that we were going to talk about here, so it's fine to say if you're unsure, but do you have any idea what those 9 questions sort of entail?
I don't, but I can tell you what the 2-question one was.
Okay.
So it is a validated tool in assessing depression risk. So basically the PHQ-2 asks, over the past 2 weeks, how often have you been bothered by any of the following problems? So question 1, little interest or pleasure in doing things, and 2, feeling down, depressed or hopeless.
Okay.
And then someone will give a rating of 0 to 3, 0 being not at all, 3 being nearly every day.
Okay, and so those sort of give a guide as to the risk that the person may be suffering from depression.
Exactly.
Okay, and that's obviously, as you said, been expanded upon in the more recent one. Okay, fantastic. Well, I know, knowing Tony quite well, that she might have some thoughts on that, considering her background as well. So, Tony, if you want to share your thoughts on that and experiences as well, feel free to drop more questions about that or comments about that so that we can discuss it further. For anyone else who's currently watching, I can see that there's quite a few people watching at the moment. We want to answer as many questions as possible, so do please Submit your questions. We know that diet is a topic of huge interest to anyone, so please submit any questions that you might have about diet and MS. Share your experience as well, and we'll try and answer as many of them as we can. So we've touched a little bit on research other than what you've been doing here around this topic. Do you want to talk about some of the big things that are out there that sort of correlate with what you guys have found?
Yeah, so we talked a little bit about saturated fats, which was very interesting from the Swank study. Something else that's interesting that I've been learning about over this past year are just the comorbidities, so other diseases that people with MS might have. And what I found in the literature search was that vascular comorbidities actually increase the risk of ambulatory disability, so walking disability. And it's interesting because vascular diseases have diet as a risk factor, poor diet. So it's interesting sort of forming these links. Also, increased cholesterol and BMI or obesity and blood fats are related to higher disability status in people with MS also. And these diseases are also caused by poor diet. So it's interesting seeing the link there. On that topic too, people with MS also have an increased risk of ischemic heart disease, ischemic stroke, cardiovascular disease, and coronary heart failure compared to the general population. So again, these diseases are also caused by poor diet. So it's interesting whether there's a link between poor diet and having these diseases and a predisposition or exacerbation of MS. Yeah.
And I guess that's one of the biggest things, and I've talked a little bit about this on one of the pieces that are out on MS Translate, and it is fantastic to hear that you guys are planning on doing the randomized controlled trial, because it seems that there is a push to have that done from parts of the community before they will buy into the data that's coming out. But my thoughts on it were about whether we really needed a randomized controlled trial for it, when really the essence of these dietary modifications is about adopting a healthy lifestyle, and the research that you've just talked about is, whether or not you may get benefits in terms of the MS progression and things like that, and obviously the data that you have so far suggests that you do. There's lots of other health outcomes that are beneficial, which we know people with MS are more susceptible to, like you say. So, there's lots of reasons why we should all be doing this. But
that's right, and a healthy diet's good for everyone.
Yeah.
There's not really any harmful effects, and now that we're seeing that there's a relationship with healthier diet and improved mental quality of life and decreased risk of depression, I think that's really conducive to having a good diet.
Yeah, definitely. So we've had another question come in. This one's from Brad. Hi Brad, thank you for watching. Thank you for submitting your question. He says, hi Emily, do you see a significant difference between the various MS diet interventions, or do the OMS, Dr. Wiles, Swank, Embry, Best Bet, Paleo, etc. give a similar outcome?
Yeah, so we haven't looked at that as such, because we're just looking at people's dietary habits. And again, like I was saying before, it's tricky with the diet tool to really break down and measure people's diets. So this tool that we used was for people with in cardiac rehab. So it is just a tool measuring a healthy diet for the general population as well. Yeah. So it's tricky to distinguish between the different diets. It's not something we've looked at specifically. Yeah,
you sort of looked more broadly at what their diet consisted of, rather than asking them which diet they were following.
Exactly.
Yeah. But I guess potentially from some of the things in terms of whether there's dairy, whether there's meat, sort of relate to some of the diets over others.
That's true.
And so you might be able to get some generalised thoughts on those different diets from that.
Yep, and definitely seeing that trend towards decreased disability with cutting out meat and dairy is interesting, and definitely a space to watch.
Is that at all planned in the future to try and compare the different diets, or it's more you're going to stay just with the diet quality?
Yeah, because I think this will be an approach that sort of can predict what a diet could consist of a healthy diet for people with MS.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's a way of almost being able to refine or give comments on the diets that are out there in terms of the specific things that we know seem to help with diet quality.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for the question, Brad. Hopefully that answers it. Again, for anyone who's watching, feel free to submit your questions below so that we can keep answering them. We'll go for about another 15 minutes, so if you do have questions, now's the time to ask them. Emily's excited about answering them. She wants to hear from as many of you as possible. I've told her that you're all very nice people, so ask the questions while you have the opportunity to do so. So I guess we've talked a little bit about the next steps of the research. Do you want to go into, even though it is very early days, can you sort of talk a little bit about how a randomized controlled trial might work? And I know it is very, very early days in terms of the planning of that, but how you might go about doing that?
Yeah.
It might be a difficult question to answer.
It is a little bit. I don't know if the planning's gone down to the specifics, but obviously with a randomized controlled trial, it's random. So there will be some people that are randomized to the control group. And I guess this is a good opportunity to emphasize that people in the control group are still really important to the study. It helps us to be able to compare the intervention with no intervention, because I think that's always a difficult thing with a longer randomized control trial, is keeping people in to the study that are randomized to the control group.
But it's unlikely, and again we can't talk too much about it being in the planning stage, but it's not that the different groups are going to be a high quality diet and people eating pizza every night, right? Yes. That's not going to be the different things that we're looking at in terms of the groups.
Yeah, and again, that's why diet is so tricky to study, and in terms of tools, but also controlling people's diets. So I guess the intervention in this sense will be the education sessions on a healthy lifestyle modification program for people with MS.
Fantastic, and I know that's something that the MS community in general has concerns about when they see trials on these sort of things, where there's already quite compelling evidence that there's benefits. I mean, with vitamin D trials that have been happening, because of the evidence that suggests vitamin D is beneficial in some way, shape or form. Going into a clinical trial where they might receive placebo for that doesn't necessarily appeal. So it's it's good to hear that the control group won't be people who are necessarily being put on a bad diet and missing out on those benefits. It's just that there will be a period of time where they won't necessarily have the understanding that the others might have. Okay, so as we keep going, I'm just looking at our notes here to see if there's anything that we haven't covered yet.
Yeah.
Is there anything while I'm sort of looking through and looking for the next question? Is there anything that you want to talk about that you think is important that the community hears?
Oh, another point that I had that might be interesting is how to adopt a healthy diet. And I'm not a dietitian, but obviously having looked at diet over this year, I've learned a lot more about it. And like I was saying before, I think the key is making it a lifestyle change, and it's not just a diet that's temporary. And so making it sustainable for you. So learning about alternatives you can use, staying away from deep fried and processed foods, foods that are high in sugar and fat and salt, and choosing a whole food diet with lots of fruit and vegetables. Also, flaxseed oil is a good source of polyunsaturated fatty acids. That's something that I learnt over this year. You often hear about it in fish and fish oil, but flaxseed oil is a good source as well. Also, I think the longer you do something like this, the more you learn about it. So the easier it becomes, you can learn about new recipes. There's also support groups out there, online support groups. Obviously, there's a little bit of caution with that and do your own research, but it's great to hear other people's recipes and substitutes that they use in their diet to make it healthier.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I know actually if Brad's still watching, Brad, I know you have your favourite recipes, so feel free to share one while the video is going on, Brad, I expect you to share one of your favourite recipes that you use. Challenge out to you to get that done before the video finishes. So I've just seen that we've had a bunch of new people start watching the video. So I will just introduce what we're doing for anyone that may have just joined us and wonder what we're doing here tonight. So Facebook Live Q&A with Emily O'Kearney, who's a research assistant in the neuroepidemiology unit at the University of Melbourne, doing research looking at diet outcomes for people with multiple sclerosis. We've been talking quite a bit about that research so far, so if once the video is concluded, it will stay on our Facebook page, so you can go back and watch all of the stuff that we've already talked about. But for anyone who has just started watching, we're still going to be here for a little bit longer, so if you do have any questions that you want to ask Emily about her research into diet and MS, we know that the people are interested. Please just drop your question in the comments box below, and we'll make sure that we ask it before we finish here tonight. If you don't have a question but want to share your own experiences about what you found in terms of diet modification, and we can sort of comment based on some of the data that's Emily's seen as well. We've talked about whether or not there might be benefits in terms of cutting out meat and cutting out dairy, and certainly the data so far suggests that there is. So, if that's something that you've done and seen benefits from, we'd love to hear from you as well. So make sure, we will be here for a little bit longer, so take the opportunity to ask those questions, put those comments in before we finish up. So one of the things that I find really interesting and really positive is that we've already touched on some of the other data in this area, and everything seems to be pointing in the same direction. It's not, we often see things in MS where we get quite conflicting data from different studies that we see. One thing will tell us that this is great, and then another thing will say, well, no, it's not. In terms of diet and MS, all of the data seems to be pointing in the same direction. And we had, I read a summary late last year on a study that came out of Johns Hopkins, which also looked at diet quality, and they found similar things. I've got the sort of main outcomes that we talked about here, where they said a better diet quality was associated with less severe depression. Obviously, that's something that you've already talked about, that you guys have seen in your... This is in people with MS. Sorry, yeah. Diets that had more fruits, vegetables, legumes and whole grains, less added sugar, less red meat, lower level of disability. An overall better healthy lifestyle associated with less severe depression, pain, fatigue, cognitive impairment, disability. Have you, I guess, in terms of that last dot point there, are those outcomes things that have been looked at in the holism study as well? Pain, fatigue?
They are.
If so, do you have the...
Yeah, I haven't done any analyses with pain actually, but that was something that was asked in holism. With fatigue, again, it's really trending towards being significant. So healthier diet, predicting lower fatigue. Again, it's not quite significant. If you look at it cross-sectionally, everything is pretty much significant. So if you're looking at one time point, but when we start looking at it over time, becomes more complicated, and I think we need to see longer time frames to see significance, and see more change in diet and how that affects outcomes and disease progression.
It might be worth, sorry, just as an aside, because we keep throwing out these words, and I'm wondering, no, it's something that I do all the time, and I just hit me that people might wonder why we're being so careful about the words that we use in terms of when we're talking about this data, in terms of saying it's not significant but it's trending towards significance. Now, without going into, and I know that there are people in our community who would love to have a detailed discussion about stats, and they know that I hate talking about stats, but without going into a hugely detailed explanation of what stats are, when we talk about significance and trends, what's the sort of difference there?
I guess most of the time we want to say that we're 95% sure that this relationship is occurring, not because of chance. That's the way I understand it and look at it. So when we look at the data, if it's not that, then we're saying it's not quite significant. Yeah, so
when you're saying that there's a trend, it's that, yes, there certainly looks like there's a relationship there, but at the moment, the stats that you do don't necessarily say that that's significant, but as you say, over a longer time period, when we follow that out, that trend may become significant. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I thought that was worth sort of.
And like I was saying, it is significant at a cross-sectional level. So at the one time point, when you look at diet at baseline and outcome at baseline, everything is really related.
Okay.
But it's start looking at these sort of causality over time, that's where it becomes more difficult.
Yeah. So, true to form, Brad has shared a recipe. Thank you, Brad. And at 8:10, when I haven't had dinner. Have you had dinner?
No.
So I'm exceptionally hungry now. So he shared a recipe for hot cross bruffins, which I assume is in between hot cross bread and hot cross muffins, cross buns, muffins. That sounds delicious. So for anyone who's watching, feel free to copy Brad's recipe for hot cross bruffins. And
can I ask if they're low in saturated fat?
Brad, are they low in saturated fat? They look like it. You can give us some information about the diet quality of your hot cross bruffins, but they look amazing. And are they available in supermarkets from the 1st of January, like hot cross buns? Because if so, I'm interested.
I just thought of something we could point out too, that saturated fats are actually found in meat and dairy products, in case people don't know about saturated fats and unsaturated fats. Yeah. So just that past research, especially with the Swank study, showing that a low saturated fat diet slows the progression of MS. It's interesting to note.
Okay. And I think one of the things, again, when we talk about this, there's quite a bit of evidence talking about omega-3, omega-6, and their importance. One, do you have any data that sort of talks about that? And we may have already talked about it a little bit, but worth sort of revisiting. And if so, I guess one of the things that's useful in talking about is what are some good sources of that for people, I guess, to be able to do.
Maybe we can talk a little bit about polyunsaturated fatty acids, because I think in terms of what your stomach's grumbling...
Sorry, that I don't know if that came through, but my stomach just made a very loud... I blame you, Brad.
So what I've learned is polyunsaturated fatty acids, so they can't be made by the body, and they help make our cells more pliable, in a sense, like more fluid. And they also help to suppress inflammation in the body. So we know that's particularly important for people with MS. And they also help dampen the immune response, which is also important in autoimmune diseases like MS. So just to explain that maybe a little bit, so the cell membranes are made up of fats that we ingest from the diet, and if they are made up of saturated fats, they tend to be more hard and brittle, and that causes diseases like clot diseases like strokes, but also diseases of hardening of the arteries, so like high blood pressure. But if the cell membranes are made up more of polyunsaturated fats, they're more pliable and resistant to degeneration, which is important, obviously, in terms of the myelin sheath, etc.
Okay. And so, just as the follow-up, some good sources.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Sorry. No,
so polyunsaturated fats, particularly the omega-3s, are the ones that seem to suppress inflammation, can be found in fish oil, flaxseed oil, and some other seeds and nuts like walnuts are high in omega-3s, chia seeds, hemp seeds as well. Okay. I don't know if that's controversial, but yeah.
It's out there now, that's fine. And actually Eric's watching and he's dropping some things. We also had a summary a while back about some work done by the neuroepidemiology unit here talking about flaxseed oil being beneficial for people with MS. So the link to that summary is now below the video as well for people who want to read that. And Brad has come back and said that they are low in saturated fat. Eric has also put a challenge out to the MS Translate community and asked everyone to copy that recipe and take a photo of the bruffins that they make, post that under this video, and maybe we'll have a contest and give a prize out to the best looking bruffins. Brad, you're banned from it though, so you can't participate. Ian has asked a question, so thank you, Ian, for watching and asking a question. He's asked, do you have any information about the effects of fasting when combined with a good diet?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think there's some emerging research around that, and we haven't looked at that in particular, but I think the evidence is pointing towards the fasting period actually switching your body into anti-inflammation mode, if you like, so suppressing inflammation. So I think that's really beneficial, and also obviously fasting, you're not eating as much, so you're not ingesting as many calories, which can be beneficial as well. I don't know too much about that, but I do know about the evidence of fasting and suppressing the inflammation.
Yeah, and I think that is something that George has talked about previously. Out of curiosity, how would that, if people were adopting a fasting part in their diet, how would that affect their diet quality score?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because with this is more your diet habits.
Okay. So it's more across the long term rather than necessarily what you're eating every day.
It's not asking about how much energy or kilojoules or calories that you're ingesting.
Okay.
It's more asking about your habits. So, for example, how many days a week do you eat legumes?
Yeah.
So that it's tricky with that.
Yeah. So there may be some impact, but generally, should still even out as long as the rest of the diet is that healthy one, like Ian's talking about. Hopefully that answers your question, Ian. It is definitely an interesting area. There, as Emily said, there is some interesting research coming out in that space. So we might look to put a summary up on that research in the coming weeks as well to provide a bit more detail around that area. Tony's just asked another question. She says, Emily, is there any chance that you can analyse data to understand location differences? So by that, I assume by that Tony's talking about in terms of location differences in terms of the latitude gradient, longitude gradient, that you see in terms of MS. Is that included at all? It
is in the holism study, and we do have a variable that looks at latitude and location.
Okay.
Yeah.
And is there anything, have you noticed anything in terms of that?
I think most of the evidence now is showing that the higher the latitude, the increased risk of MS. Is that how you
trying to work it out?
Sorry, that's not my area, but
the further away from the equator.
The equator. Yeah.
Trying to work out what's a high and a low latitude. Yep.
Yeah.
Further away from the equator. Yep.
Yep. Which is probably related to vitamin D exposure from the sun.
Yep.
I'm guessing.
Yep.
Also, that tends to be a lot of the countries with Western diets, which is interesting as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
so Western diets that are high in saturated fats and tend to be more unhealthy.
In terms of the vitamin D side of things, and I know you talked a little bit about that, in terms of it is something that you tried to capture in terms of the holism study.
Mm-hmm.
Was there any sort of trends that you could see in terms of that?
That's not something I looked at, because we looked at vitamin D supplementation and sun exposure separately in a different study, but I'm pretty sure there were strong associations with better outcomes.
It can be something that we can. We'll get more people from the holism study involved as well, and get them to talk about it.
For sure. And I can give a summary about that once I read the paper again.
Oh, fantastic!
Yeah,
it's even better. It's more less work for me to have to do as well. Okay, so we'll finish up in a few more minutes. So if anyone has any last questions, now is definitely the time to ask it, and we'll make sure that. That we do, if they come through after the video is finished, we'll make sure that we get back to you. Either I'll reply or I'll pass that question on to Emily, and we'll get back to you with a response in the comments section. So in the last couple of minutes, if you do have a question, drop it in now. Otherwise, we will get back to you at a later date. So I guess just sort of as a bit of a summary for people who may just have joined now, do you sort of just want to, in a nutshell, summarise the sort of research again in terms of what you've done and what the major outcomes have been for that so far?
Yeah, so we've been looking at diet habits and creating a diet score, and looking at the relationship with diet and outcomes. And in particular, this was a longitudinal study, so we had data at baseline and data from 2.5 years later from the same people. So we looked at diet at baseline and whether this is related to outcomes at the follow-up period. And we've found so far, looking at those variables, that diet is related, a healthier diet is related to decreased depression risk and increased mental quality of life.
Okay, so fantastic. Sorry, just to follow up Tony's question, we were completely wrong in terms of how we interpreted Tony's question.
Okay.
That's my fault.
That's okay.
She was actually asking about whether there were diet differences across different locations. So whether or not you could see any differences in the diets people were doing across different locations.
That's really interesting. It's not something that I looked at specifically, and I don't know whether the group has, aside from this particular study that I'm doing, but it would be interesting.
Yeah, I guess if there is, it may not be something that's done, but I guess if you were capturing some location information, that analysis could be done.
Yeah, it's possible.
And to see if there was anything in there. So possibly something that they will look at in the future, Tony, and we apologise for getting your question up the putt. I take full responsibility from that. Questions just come in from Lynn. Thank you for watching, Lynn, and thanks for asking your question. She's asked what sort of fasting were we talking about, a whole day or 16 hours, and how often do you do it?
Yeah, I can't comment on the specifics around that.
Yeah. So Lynn, that was based on, we had another question asking about whether there was any evidence about fasting and diet quality and whether that had any benefits for people with MS. There is some information to suggest that fasting may be useful for some people in terms of having that as part of their dietary modifications, and we will look to summarise that. Well, I'll go through and look at the papers that have been published in that area, and we can look to summarise that in an article that will appear on MS Translate in the coming weeks. It's not something that's been looked at in detail in this holism study, and not something that Emily's done analysis on, so we can't comment too much on that at the moment.
But it is looking like fasting helps to suppress inflammation.
Yeah, that's one of the big things. So we will, as we said, we'll follow up with that, seeing as it seems to be something that people are really interested in, and we'll provide some more information on that over the coming weeks. So as I do a final check for any new questions that have come in, it doesn't appear that there's any at the moment. So considering it's getting close to 8:30, you've already had a long day. We'll let you go, but from MS Translate, from the MS Translate community, thank you very much for your time this evening. It's really appreciated. I hope that everyone that's watching at home realises the sort of dedication that people like Emily have to finding out answers to help benefit the MS community, and we couldn't do what we do without people like Emily, I'm getting the name right, agreeing to give up her time on a Tuesday evening to participate in these events and to talk to everyone about her research and answer questions. So thank you. It's been a pleasure. I'm sure everyone that's watched it has enjoyed it, and it's been really informative. I'm sure we will probably get more questions come through from people who haven't been able to join us live. But in closing, thank you again for your time, and I'm sure we will hear from you more in the future.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks for all your questions and comments and recipes, and yeah, it's fantastic. Thank you.
We'll all go home and try some hot cross muffins. All right, thanks everyone. We'll look to do another research Q&A in the near future. We'll let you know when they're around. Thank you all for your participation, and we look forward to talking soon.